Welcome to Spin Out.
I'm Dave,
And I'm Winner.
and we're here to demystify venture
Minimize FOMO.
and discuss the relationships between GPs and LPs.
So AGM season is upon us. I have been to 4 AGMs in the last 2 weeks, and it's only March. And so we figured it's a perfect time to unpack what is an annual general meeting, an AGM. These meetings, which are hosted annually by GPs, general partners of venture funds and private equity funds, have actually changed a lot, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're going to dive into the components of an AGM today and different ways to construct an AGM. If you're a GP and you're trying to figure out, what makes sense, how should I build an AGM? This is the perfect episode for you. So we're super excited to talk about AGMs today. So let me pass it over to Dave and introduce the different components of AGMs.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I think whenever people are starting to plan or think through their AGM, it's always good to come back to the basics of it, right? What are you trying to achieve? And what is ultimately the point of hosting this meeting, whether you're doing something virtual in your first year, or you're doing kind of something, low key, or whether you're taking it up several notches and you're doing what we'll call, almost like a destination wedding type AGM. So regardless of what type of AGM you are going to have, there are still some things that you basically want to achieve, right? So first is contractually, you're probably obligated in your LPA to have an annual meeting where you bring all the partners together, and the goal of which is to update them on the progress of the fund. So think of it as basic metrics, showing them some of the investments that you've made, allowing them some insight into the ongoings of the fund that as limited partners, they don't get to see day to day. Second, if you do have an LPAC, so an advisory committee of your limited partners, so an limited partners advisory committee, right? If you do have that, almost like a board for your fund, you might have a closed door separate session for your board members, right? And that is there for them to address different kind of fund business. They might have to extend a period or talk about a different type of investment, or they might just be providing general feedback to the GP. Then you have, the idea where you want to introduce your LPs to your founders. So there's usually some amount of people bringing founders in, doing panels, doing discussions. The ultimate goal there is to kind of increase the commercial opportunities. And then, we can't forget that when you're bringing all these people together, they really want to network. The LPs want to network with themselves. The founders want to network within their group. And then there's obviously the goal of cross-pollinating the network, the founders and the LPs, to bring everything together. And then lastly, this kind of what's becoming more and more today of a big part of AGM planning is you want to do something memorable, exciting, that brings the community together and creates kind of lasting relationships between your founders, between your LPs, and then ultimately between everybody. So I think those are basic components or building blocks of an AGM. And then the next kind of thing is what's the right vibe or right experience that you're trying to host based off of your fund, your LPs, and your founders. So I'll turn it back over to you, Winner. Why don't you kind of walk us through those different levels of AGMs that we've been experiencing going to the last couple of years?
We've thought about AGMs in 3 buckets, and we'll kind of go into each bucket and we'll, maybe break out a couple of examples in each bucket. But the buckets are simple. There's the table stakes AGM, right? Maybe you're required to do this. It's mandated by your paperwork. And so you just put it together and think of that as just like reporting, right? Like you're reporting to your LPs, it's table stakes. Then there's and a lot of times that's virtual. So we're going to go into that in a second. Second is like what we're calling the hotel conference room. It's in person. You're bringing everyone together. There is a community aspect to it. And this is probably the most traditional one. And there's a bit more to it. And then, Dave mentioned the destination wedding, which I love this one. Because this is like, as Dave says, it's not just sending an email, but it's delivering your brand and conveying your brand. So the destination wedding, we're going to go into that in a second, is really about bringing your brand to life. So Dave, why don't you tell us about the table stakes AGM? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think when I think of this kind of virtual or entry level AGM, I often do think of the fund one, right? So early on in the firm's life cycle, they're just getting going. If you don't have a tremendous amount of AUM, you want to focus those dollars on investable capital, and a big fancy meeting on a $10 million fund. Sometimes it just doesn't work for the budget. And so what you often will see is that they're virtual, but that doesn't mean that they're complacent or that they're not very well planned out. I would say quite the opposite. If you're going to do something virtual and have it work well, you want to make sure the technology works really well. But they're simple, right? So you might do one session just for LPs where you're talking through the basic metrics. Usually, sometimes this is after year end. So you have year end portfolio metrics where the fund is positioned. You might share information on upcoming capital call schedule, the need to complete out the investment period or change the investment period. And then you'll walk through the schedule of investments and kind of update LPs on how some of the companies are doing, with the goal of trying to engage the LP base in these companies, get them excited about it, or find out places where they can help. And then, kind of the second half of this meeting, you transition and allow your founders to introduce themselves to the LPs, maybe share a little bit about their company, and ultimately, again, trying to foster a follow-on connection, another meeting, an opportunity for the LP base to kind of support these portfolio companies or make helpful introductions for them. So a virtual kind of AGM, I think, ticked off three of those components that we talked about earlier. You can review and talk about the metrics with everyone. You can have an LPAC meeting on Zoom, and you can start to network your founders with your LPs.
Just tactically, right? 1 hour, max 2 hours. This should be very short. You're the GP, your early years, your early days. Things in venture don't change much week over week or month over month. Maybe they change quarter over quarter. They start to change year over year, right? So in the early years, you don't need to spend a lot of time kind of talking about portfolio and portfolio movement, but the LPs do want to know who your founders are, right? So it's important to kind of give the big picture. This is who I am as a reminder, right? Don't forget about me. This is what I'm doing. It's exciting. And here's who I'm doing it with, my founders. So, right, it doesn't need to be long, but stay top of mind with your LPs and especially like create that cadence of doing it, on an annual basis.
That's super helpful, Winter. So now let's move on to the hotel conference room version of this. So why don't you kind of walk us through initially what you see work well and this kind of next level up AGM? What are kind of the key aspects of it? And then we can talk a little bit about some of the successful AGMs we've both seen in this area.
Yeah, I think this is the traditional one. So I don't even think we'd be talking about the table stakes one before the era of emerging managers and before COVID, right? Like this is very much like a post-COVID, during COVID phenomenon. And it's kind of persisted beyond that, where it's like, there's a lot of travel, there's more funds, portfolios are bigger, right? Maybe this year I can do it virtually. So my LPs don't have to travel every week. The traditional one, again, this has been going on for a while. And some of the best funds in the world actually used to host more than just a single annual meeting, right? So it's like, happens twice a year. So, or it happens every quarter, right? But I think just keeping it simple, you're doing it once a year. This is in person. This can be relevant to Dave's point, like for emerging managers who are larger AUM. This is definitely relevant for, managers that have larger AUM, think 50 plus, right? Now you're starting to put significant dollars to work into your portfolio companies, right? You're starting to generate significant value. Like this is when, again, the folks who are investing into your fund, larger family offices, institutions, they want to know what's going on. Again, they want to meet you. They want to meet other LPs. They want to meet founders in person. They really want to get a sense for, their dollars at work, like what's it being invested into. So very important, we believe, to host, an annual in person. And the things are similar to the virtual, right? You want to give an introduction and overview of your fund, remind everyone, who you are, who the team is, what your strategy is. You want to give an update. If there's one fund, you give the update on that fund. If there's multiple funds, give the update on multiple funds, and then start going deeper, right? Start to talk about, the best companies or the new companies year over year, right? But you want to paint a picture for your LPs of the types of founders you're investing into, the types of companies you're investing into. And you want this experience to be very professionally managed because it's, one of the only touch points, significant touch points you're going to have each year with your LPs.
Thinking about this kind of traditional AGM, it's professionally managed. What is a pretty common timeline that you see for this? People come in, on a Tuesday night and you do a session and then Wednesdays all day. Like, what do you typically see as a schedule for this traditional AGM?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get a little bit more complex in a second, but this one's simple, right? Maybe you have a dinner the night before, maybe you don't, right? What are you doing in that dinner? You're bringing your limited partners together, or you're bringing your limited partners and your founders together. Maybe that dinner is the night of, right? So the AGM happens on a Tuesday, and instead of having a Monday night dinner, you have a Tuesday night dinner. Easy, right? Just keep it simple. That's the expectation for a lot of LPs. And again, like what is the timeline? Maybe
Yeah.
it's a full day. Maybe it's morning. You have a good lunch, right? Again, the LPs are talking to each other. They get a chance to talk to the founders. People are busy. Maybe you have a dinner as well.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe it's just the afternoon going into the dinner, right? Maybe it's like you have the dinner the night before and then you have the AGM in the morning and everyone breaks for lunch, right? And so there's different ways you could structure it. I think the key components are, to our earlier point, networking. Make sure there's ample time for LPs to talk to LPs, for LPs to talk to you, and for LPs to talk with founders. So how are you going to construct that? Think dinner, breakfast, lunch, or think breakfast, lunch, dinner, right? I
Yeah.
think that's the easiest way to kind of think about it.
Obviously, in an LP close session, you're probably reviewing PowerPoint slides and talking about metrics. But what are some of the other types of either media or interactions people have? Are people doing demos? Are there panels? Like, what are you kind of experiencing when you go to one of these traditional AGMs?
Think of it as there's these different pieces. First, they want to hear from you, whoever the GP is, right? If
Sure.
there's multiple GPs, they want to hear from most likely all of you. So if there's four GPs, make sure the presentation is split. So all four of you at some point are addressing a component during the presentation. The other piece is they want to hear from your founders, right? So how do they want to hear from those founders? It could be you or another GP interviewing the founder. It could be the founder giving a presentation, right? Maybe that's the back of like, hey, we think this strategy this year is very important. We think the next 5 years of venture are going to be very focused on this. Let us have two or three founders present on this topic. We've made, two or three investments now into this topic area, and we want you to really understand what that topic area is and the quality of founder we're investing into. So that founder can give a presentation. To your point, right? Like there can be panels, right? Maybe you bring all three of those founders up at the same time to kind of talk about that theme and elucidate that theme a bit more. So just know, like, we won't go into all the different permutations there, but just know, like, you have flexibility. The key points are you want LPs to walk away with a good understanding of your numbers, a good understanding of the themes and the strategies you're going to be employing over the last year and ideally over the next year, and have a really good understanding of what's in your portfolio. And again, what is probably going to be in your portfolio deployed over the next year. Those are the big key points.
And then as an LP, when you were going to a lot of annual meetings, now as a fund manager yourself and investing in these funds, I assume you're doing diligence for the next fundraise and you're trying to assess, many parts of how this manager kind of runs their business, but also completes or executes on their strategy. You're kind of softly collecting intel as you're at these meetings, talking to their founders or to the other LPs as well.
Oh, don't tell them. So yes, I think the key point here is, you as a GP are communicating to an LP,
Mhm.
a certain strategy, certain portfolio construction, and the LP's job is to understand how you're building out what you told them you're going to build out, right? So the annual meeting is, yeah, a really good touch point to kind of understand that. I said I was going to put these types of investments into my portfolio. I go to the annual meeting and it's like, okay, are those types of investments in the
Yeah.
portfolio, right? Especially for larger institutions that have to manage exposures, right? And, have to understand, like, benchmark against quality. Like, these are very important events, and
Yeah.
not to be taken lightly. So I want to shift gears here. Dave, maybe you can introduce. So again, we've introduced the virtual, we've introduced the traditional in person. Now we're going to go a little bit more complex, right? Into what we call, almost like the destination wedding, or, what some of us call like a brand centric annual meeting. So what do we mean by that? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think recently, over the last few years, what I've started to notice, and I've heard GPs say this very explicitly, is they're looking for a way to differentiate themselves from their other fund managers and just from the general, attention-seeking world that their LPs are bombarded with. They need to get in front of these folks and capture their attention for a certain period of time. And so, what can you do? How do you leverage your investments, your brand, your firm's network to what not somewhat jokingly say, but what's the coolest room that you can put your founders and your LPs into? And coolest is subjective. It's not necessarily just celebrity or, Instagram influencer type cool. What it could mean though is your LPs really care about being at the cutting edge of technology and you can introduce them to the technologists building at the cutting edge. That might be in this particular case, a very cool thing that your LPs are looking for, right? So the next level up is really focused on providing a truly world-class experience for your founders and LPs. And I've seen more and more funds spend time, energy, and effort less on the traditional AGM style and maybe even every other year or in some different capacity, really trying to highlight their, firm, their brand, their network, and their kind of, joie de vivre, wasta, whatever kind of, intangible thing that they have, they want to showcase that to LPs. And so I think you're seeing locations that are chosen not based off of where the fund is necessarily managed. They're not always just in the spring right after annual, financials are released. They'll have really high-end keynote speakers or guests that appear, and they often tend to be very commercially focused, trying to bridge founders and LPs together. So that's the general movement that I've seen. It's not every firm doing it, but it is something that I've noticed a lot of firms are putting more thoughtful and deliberative energy into building out these types of experiences for founders and for LPs.
The destination wedding, the brand centric AGM,
Mhm.
um, just kind of make this a bit more practical. I've been to about 7 annual meetings in the last 2 weeks. 4 of those are in
Mhm.
person, 3 of those are virtual. The
Yep.
3 that were virtual, I would almost mark as confused, right? It was almost like, was it an AGM or was it just an update, right? I don't think there was enough structure for it to be an AGM, but it was a missed opportunity, right? Got an update, but it wasn't a full AGM. But again, like this gives you the kind of sense of pacing for maybe, an LPA is getting exposed to a lot of these. So to Dave's point, how do you stand out? What do you do? And a couple things to think about, maybe instead of that dinner, breakfast, lunch, right? Or breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe you actually make it a 2-day event, right?
Mm.
So you have a founder retreat on day one and the annual meeting on day two, or the annual meeting on day one and a founder retreat on day two. And you're kind of bringing your portfolio founders together, to have a heart to heart, to kind of talk about the tough problems they're facing, right? And to try to, present an opportunity to discuss, potential solutions for your founders, right? So you can turn an AGM into something more than just a presentation for your LPs. And you can also make it value added for your founders, right? So that's another way to think about it. Again, the destination wedding can also be, you have an annual meeting, you're updating LPs, you're using it as a marketing tool. So you're bringing in other LPs, and then you transition or segue into conference or some type of summit, right? So it's different. It's not just for your founders or it's not strategic to your portfolio, but it's like strategic to your community or to your brand. If you're thinking about it from like a brand experience, right? Like you're trying to stand out, a lot of the relationship in venture, right, is of course it's numbers driven and it's performance driven, but it's also like emotionally driven, right? And so you're
Yep.
thinking about, and you're trying to stay top of mind. You're trying to stand out. So you can help your founders. You can be value add. You can think about your strategy. You can build that community. But you can also think about a special experience, right? So an example would be like you do your in-person, traditional hotel room AGM in San Francisco, and then the next day you bus ride with your LPs up to Napa and you do winemaking all day and you bottle some wine that's going to be ready in 2 years and you've like, private labeled. Like that's an interesting experience, right? Definitely requires more
Mhm.
planning and more complexity. And, ultimately your LPs are going to be paying for that probably. But again, like there's some stuff you can do, right? That make it a special experience and that can contribute to your brand.
And to your point about cost, I mean, as the CFO, we're constantly thinking about the budget for these types of events. And you're right that, there are a fixed set of dollars inside a fund, and an AGM can use some of those dollars. But I've seen very creative fund managers. I'm going to an annual meeting later this year. It's in a fancy destination location in Aspen. And we are having a number of service providers that we work with that want to have access to our portfolio down the line, whether they're law firms or banks or what other, and they're going to help sponsor this event because they want to be top of mind to our founders. Our LPs are business owners in this case, so the banks and law firms are also very interested in getting to know them and networking with them. And so there are ways to manage the costs of all this, even though we keep talking about more and more and more and doing something cool. It is often, the key here is to make 1 + 1 = 5 in venture. You can do that with expenses as well. And I think all of this is a test, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a way to do really cool breakout experiences and have other industry partners come together to help you, as you say, put on this summit. So there's lots of things you can do.
Compounding on the budget note, potentially you could, for that extra day, instead of going up to Napa, you could go to 3 of your portfolio offices, right? Let's say
Yeah.
you're a deep tech fund and you could expose LPs to the actual, build process, right?
Hmm.
You ask to borrow 30 or 60 minutes of, the company's time to kind of show them, right? It brings it to life different than like the CEO or C-suite coming and presenting again in a hotel room. You're going to the actual company. So, that costs as much as a taxi ride or a bus ride, or maybe you can even walk. So thinking
Yep.
creatively is the point around, again, what brings your brand to life, what helps your LPs really understand you more and your investment strategy more, understand your portfolio more. And again, understanding what you're building, right? Everyone's building a long-term relationship here. So
And you can build this over multiple years, right? Like one year can be very much focused on a rebrand and a launch of the hospitality focus of what you're doing. The next year, you might put a lot of effort into commercial opportunities within the portfolio. And then the following year is back to some sort of, LLP networking experience. Like, you can have these thematic ideas that kind of string together multiple years and give your annual meeting this broader storyline that it's not just this herky-jerky thing you plan every year, read a PowerPoint slide to a couple people, but it over time, to your point of building this community and engaging the principals, because that's the hardest part, right? We've all been to these annual meetings. It's hard year after year to get the brand name or the named partner or the family office principal to come to all these events because there is so much asked of them. There is so much time constraints that they already have on their calendars that you need to do something that stands out to get them there. Your annual meeting might be that spark for your portfolio company founder to link with an enterprise company CEO. And it's hard to do that if you're not putting in that effort. But if you do, magic can happen. And so, yeah, I think those who plan a really strong AGM, you can tell. And those who phone it in, you can also really tell. Maybe that's how they do other things as part of the business.
I want to touch on three more just kind of tactical points, right? Materials. Like you're probably spending definitely a couple days, if not a couple of weeks on AGM materials, right? This is like especially if it's a once a year exercise, like you're
Hmm.
pulling together everything. You're doing a strategy deep dive, you're doing a portfolio deep dive, you're working with your CFO, your finance team to kind of pull that information together. And again, it's a separate deck you're creating or presentation
Hmm.
and you're sharing that with LPs afterwards. So that's just a tactical thing. Like, how does it work? You're sharing that like the next day in 24 hours.
We get asked to do interim metrics, right? So that's a totally normal and fine thing to do. Is you'll have your quarterly numbers, but maybe a deal marks up the week prior to your AGM. Finance teams are constantly being asked to update metrics, update numbers, and then you put in the right footnotes. But like you want your best numbers showing when you come to your AGM.
Yeah. Um, Another tactical piece is we kind of touched on it, but LPAC versus no LPAC,
Mm.
right? So again, the dinner, breakfast, lunch, or the breakfast, lunch, dinner, like your LPAC might be somewhere in there. Like let's say you do dinner, breakfast, lunch, maybe lunch is with your LPAC. So if you have an LPAC, some of you may not, but this is a really easy, low lift. People are already there, especially if it's in person, right? To kind of, engage with them, talk to them, kind of leverage them for feedback. And again, like you're creating maybe another presentation, a separate presentation that's a little bit different than what you're sharing when you're actually delivering your AGM to all the LPs and everyone. But it's more, again, strategic and tactical to kind of like, what you need support on. And again, that's what your LPAC is there for. So, make use of that. And then lastly, I kind of touched on this as well, but again, think of this event like the AGM as a marketing tool. Like it's another touch point, it's another signal for, how institutional quality you are. It's another opportunity to, build relationships with your existing LPs and build relationships with new LPs, right? Prospective LPs.
So to that last point you just made, the audience, who do you see normally getting invited to these annual meetings? I assume it's not just limited to the actual limited partners of the funds and a few founders, but what are some of the other people that you might see get invited to an annual meeting?
Yeah, I think most are the existing limited partners. And then again, there's invitations extended typically to the portfolio that's presenting. So the CEOs, and sometimes those CEOs are actually investors in the fund, right? So they're
Mhm.
both, there on behalf of the portfolio company, but there as, an individual check writer into the fund. That's a pretty common strategy. Sometimes there's service providers, right? To your point, like if you can
Yep.
offset some cost of an annual meeting, that's definitely a common strategy for smaller funds. And then the last bucket is, prospective LPs. So once a year, right? Maybe in advance of fundraising by a year or less than a year, right? Like you want those people, if you're proud of what you're doing, like you want those people to understand a little bit more and get kind of an inside look. So yes, you invite, LPs that aren't invested yet, but potentially invest in the next fund.
All right, so moving on to our final segment, our Did You See? This week we're going to call out and proud to announce Winter. You've got an important date upcoming and a big event. So Winter, why don't you tell us about what's coming up in the spring for Coolwater?
Yeah. So for those listening, we're going to do our spring demo day in San Francisco on May 12th. So it's a GP event. So we're going to be inviting specialist funds, new funds that are launching this year. These could be spin outs. These could be founder turned VCs. Again, these could be specialist managers doing cool stuff in cool markets. So expect to see some really interesting funds there. And then also LPs, right? People that want to invest in this community, early stage venture, early stage private equity, you know, alternative funds, LP curious, GP curious people, everyone's welcome to register. And we're trying to build kind of a, very compelling event where the touch points between GPs and LPs kind of leads to network building and, more connections to support this part of the market.
Great. We'll see you there.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Talk to you next week.
See you next week.